broadly. There are some people in the room who have structured contributions to make, as well as the three presenters. So they will have plenty of time to do that. And the idea of the schedule really is just to keep us on track. We don't have to stick exactly to those timings. When we agreed the schedule, we thought we might need more breaks. In fact, yesterday it ran fairly straightforwardly with just one break. So we'll just see how we're going to go. A couple of other points. As I said, Martin isn't in the room yet. He had another engagement. He will join later. And Shetul found out that his local electricity authorities are going to cut the electricity at 4 o'clock London time. So we have to get Shetul in before that, assuming that the Norwegians do these things on time. So, yeah, I mean, we're going to try and be quite brief to maximize the time from participants, both questions and observations. Obviously, we're also mindful that, slightly oddly, this is the only session this week that is being addressed primarily by foreigners, but obviously we'll have lots of voices, many of whom have worked as diplomats and other foreign policy insights as we go through. So I think that's all from me. I mean, just a reminder in terms of the Zoom protocol that everyone's muted by the moderator and controllers during the talks. But when you want to speak, firstly, raise your hand if you can, and either I or one of the technicians will see it. And then obviously unmute yourselves as you talk. But you'll get reminded anyway. I mean, it seems to have worked fairly well the last 2 days, and I see no reason why it shouldn't today. So without further ado, can I ask Dan to kick us off with Eritrea Ethiopia ties. Over to you, Dan.
You got me? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So David had asked me to introduce myself a little bit, and I know I don't have to tell you who I am, but let me tell you a little bit about what I've been doing. As I think many of you know, I was teaching for many years at Simmons University in Boston, and 6 years ago I retired, and since that time I have been going back and forth to the region in broad strokes, following the refugee situation, and on a consulting relationship with the Foreign Ministry of Norway. That ended yesterday, by the way, so today I'm a free man. But during that time, I went to 19 different countries to interview refugees about how they got out, why they left, what their experiences have been, and would they go back. And I think that continues to inform my work. My last trip to the refugee camps along the border and the border itself was last November. I was in Ethiopia again in February, got up to Mekelle, but not to Shire, to the camps. I was scheduled to go back in May, but of course we all know what happened to that. So that's a little bit of the background and where I'm coming from. I have actually been back in Eritrea a couple of times, like 20 meters across the border, but that's it, since 2002. So as we started this year, little had really changed. It looked like 2020 would be a lot like 2019. Nothing had really changed inside Eritrea in terms of the after effects of the peace agreement. And Ethiopia was continuing along more or less as it had been as well. The situation in Ethiopia looked deeply unsettled. The ethnic conflict continued to rage at different times, not as dramatically as it had been the previous year, but it was still there, and it was bursting out in incidents every so often to remind us. The big question was elections and when they would be held in Ethiopia. And in Eritrea, for his part, he was remained completely obsessed with punishing the TPLF and blaming the TPLF for all of Eritrea's problems. And he was conditioning relations with Ethiopia and the normalization process on advancing the goal of squeezing the TPLF. Then two things happened. One, a product of those factors, and that was the change in Ethiopia's policy toward the refugees in the north. And the second thing, of course, was the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. And I want to come back to the refugee issue in a few minutes, but I want to heighten, just to highlight the fact that it marked both a move on the part of Isaias to bring down the bad publicity that Eritrea was getting for all the people leaving, and an effort to stem the tide of people leaving, which was draining the country at the base in ways that were starting to seriously compromise its ability to function as a state. In January, as I think many of you know, Isaias and Abiy met. One of the things to come out of that was an order from Abiy to ARA, the Ethiopian Refugee Agency in the north, to shut down the flow of refugees from Eritrea. That was a demand, as I understood it, from Isaias that was conveyed to Abiy during that meeting. And Abiy cooperated immediately, changing a policy that had been in effect for many, many years in Ethiopia to give Eritreans, as they did with every other neighboring country, prima facie recognition as refugee status within Ethiopia, based solely on their proof of citizenship. So I'm going to come back to that in a few seconds, but I want to just highlight the fact that there have been major humanitarian complications and ramifications from this, but it was essentially a political move. The pandemic, of course, we know, Isaias immediately in March shut the country down, and the numbers have been manageable within Eritrea ever since, if you believe them. Ethiopia did a partial shutdown because, of course, they couldn't do much more, but used this as a political reason or a logistical reason for a political move, which was to delay elections until 2021. So I think the one thing that I'm sure all of you are aware of is that Isaias has used this as a political move as well, because it really had the effect of containing internal movement, slowing down the outflow of people on the one side, and also curbing the protests that were going on within Eritrea, particularly the Yakul movement. It also had the economic consequences of squeezing an already stagnant economy that was virtually on life support, and has left people in a very dire situation facing an economic catastrophe. Much of that is hidden from public view because of the lockdown and the absence of reporting from inside. But it's a simmering problem that is still building within Eritrea. So let me just start with some thoughts about Ethiopia at this point, because I think the internal situations within each country have a very profound effect on the relations between them. First thing, the situation in Ethiopia on the ethnic front. In the paper that I wrote, I went through a number of incidents. I'm not going to recount those here. I think many of you are probably familiar with them. The latest that, of course, to erupt was the assassination of the popular Oromo protest singer on Monday in Addis Ababa, which has triggered riots in Addis and unrest in many parts of Oromia. Many deaths as well so far, and many rumors, of course, with some in the Amhara media trying to blame TPLF, predictably, others trying to blame Egypt, and the rest of us waiting to see what the government is going to say, because they have apparently arrested a number of suspects on this. They have also arrested Jawar Mohammed and Bekele Gerba, as you may be aware. And all of this signals the fragility, the continuing fragility of Ethiopia as they move through this pandemic crisis and also the political crisis that underlies the situation and intersects with the pandemic. So if you look around at the country, you see the continuing instability within the populations and the parties. The situation is perhaps most intense within the Oromia state and the Amhara state, with tensions between the Prosperity Party of Abiy and the nationalist parties, of which there are quite a few in each state. There are at least 7 in Oromia. There are at least 4 in Amhara. Tigray, meanwhile, has 8 parties. But out of all this, it's very difficult to see how Abiy can build a workable coalition, except on a transactional basis at the end of this. The smaller states like Afar, Somali, Benishangul, Gurage, Gambela, and Harare are harder to figure out at this point. They are likely to make transactional deals with whoever they think is going to win. But the possibility exists that Abiy will not win in Oromia or Amhara, and certainly not Tigray. And the big question, I think, then in Ethiopia, although it's been postponed, is the same question that we're asking in the US. What does an authoritarian leader do if he loses an election? And it's not clear whether he would step down in a situation like that or find another way of postponing the results. Meanwhile, there is the situation between Tigray and Addis Ababa over the elections. The TPLF, as I'm sure you're aware, has said that they're going to hold their own elections before October 3rd. Abiy has threatened Tigray if they try it. And Tigray has responded last week by saying that if Abiy continues on the road that he's on with the postponement of elections, they will not recognize him as prime minister after October 3rd. So there are multiple factors here that contribute to the destabilization of Ethiopia and the continued fragility of the state itself. Into that mix comes the relation with Eritrea, which Abiy has pinned hopes on for some benefit, and has also built a kind of tacit alliance with Isaias to squeeze the TPLF, as we've seen. And I think that in the end, in the short term at least, is the most serious issue that we face. And I know Shuttle will get into this in detail, so I'm not going to go into the internal situation in Tigray at this point.
Dan, just to flag that you have 15 minutes now.
Okay. No, it's 13. The situation in Eritrea. At the start of 2020, Eritrea's economy was utterly stagnant. Then you had the lockdown. Nearly 2 years since the peace declaration, there is no real measurable progress on normalization apart from telecommunications and air connections between the two countries, and a private relationship between Isaias and Abiy. That is something that cannot be sustained. Let's see. If the time is running tight here, so I want to go back for a second to the refugee situation. The the crisis that I mentioned is described in an article that I posted without signing on Eritrea Hub, The Truth Behind the Hitsats Crisis, which if you haven't seen yet, I would urge you to go to. There are a lot of rumors that have gone around about that as well. But it is a move by Isaias to try to contain the outflow of people from the country, to stem the bleeding out of the country at the base of the society itself. I think that's important for a couple of reasons to Eritrea Focus. One is the way it provides a window onto the declining situation within Eritrea and the dangers that go along with that in the future. In terms of reconstructing the society after the change that we all assume will come at some point. And two, it provides a laboratory really for demonstrating what are the values and the programs that are proposed for Eritrea later on. And there are tens of thousands of Eritreans now in Tigray state who are not getting federal support because they have not been recognized as refugees. There are more coming in despite the lockdown in Eritrea, and they need help, and they're also important for reconstructing the country afterward. In fact, they may be one of the biggest resources Eritrea has. So I would urge more attention to them in the long term. I think the things that need to happen to end this standoff are obvious. Number one, the rift between TPLF and Abiy has to be healed, without which it will be manipulated by Isaias and continue to be a threat to stability in Ethiopia, as well as the possibility of ultimate peace with Eritrea. And two, then the situation between Eritrea and Tigray needs to be resolved with Abiy's intervention to help bring that about. And I think we should be putting some pressure in that direction for Abiy to step back from his disruptive actions to date on that score. I'm not going to talk about what peace would look like. I think we are all familiar with that. There has been a lot of discussion of Badme, whether Tigray will give back Badme or not. I just want to say, as I did a year ago, that I don't think Badme is really a serious issue. It is easy enough for the state of Tigray to build another Badme 10 kilometers to the south. The real sticking issue here is the Arab community northeast of Adigrat. So I'll just leave that one there. It can be resolved. There are ways to do it, but if it's not resolved by tweaking the border agreement a little bit, you're going to have to deal with major resettlement issues. And that needs to be thought about now as well. I'm going to leave it there because I think there's much more to say, but there are other people ready to say it. So thank you, David.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. And thanks for sticking to time, which means we're more or less on schedule. So thank you. And we'll pass straight to Kjetil in Norway. Kjetil, over to you.
Thank you, David. And hello to everyone. Happy to be joining you on this session, although I'm a bit afraid that I will be cut short because the power cut here in Oslo. So I'm going to be very quick and mention just a handful of points when it comes to the Tigray-Eritrea relations. And it builds directly upon what Dan has been talking about in that regard. And as we know, foreign policy strategies are always a reflection of both domestic interest as well as external concerns of the states in regard. In that way, the internal political dynamics will have a direct influence on how a government thinks about and shapes its foreign relations. And we see that particularly now in Ethiopia, as it is such a dramatic transition Ethiopia has undergone over the last few years. In Ethiopia today, what complicates it, as Dan talked about, is the existence of two relevant governments of interest and relevance to Eritrean affairs. That's the federal government and, of course, the regional government in Mekelle. And since, for the first time in Ethiopian history, you do have an opposition party as government at the regional state level, this complicates it even further. And both Addis Ababa and Mekelle government have a concrete interest to use the external relations with Eritrea in order to strengthen their own position within Ethiopia versus whatever adversary they see in that context. The changes observed in Ethiopia after the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed and the establishment of a prosperity party as a takeover party from EPRDF has really forced TPLF to rethink its relationship both with West Ethiopia, its relationship with Eritrea and other neighboring countries, and of course also its policies of going forward. And what is remarkable is also you see quite rapid new thinking of the TPLF leadership of today on how to perceive the context they are operating within. First of all, I need to make also a distinction that we need to be careful in distinguishing between TPLF as the party and government in Tigray and the Tigrayan people in general. They are not the same in many aspects in terms of interests and the views and policies, but on certain other issues they conflate and overlap more intimately. But a lot of the policy changes or the policy rethinking we see in TPLF today is actually pushed by the grassroots and is advocated by a mainstream Tigrayan discourse, forcing TPLF to rethink key policy issues which were rejected a year or two ago or even downplayed just some few months back. I'm coming back to that. The last 2 years, or even you can go further back, the last 4 or 5 years since the protest movement started in 2015, 2016, Tigrayans as individuals and as a collective have been more and more hesitant about their position within the Ethiopian state. They have felt and they have perceived themselves to be victimized and persecuted, both individually and collectively. And their individual and collective security as guaranteed by the federal government have been put in question over and over again. This has led to then a more collective discourse in Tigray on where do we belong? Who should we be close to? Who can we partner with? Where is our natural allies, both culturally, historically, politically? Since we no longer feel safe within the Ethiopian framework as it is operationalized today, and as long as the federal government cannot protect our interest or our well-being or our security. What can we do to come back to a process where we feel more secure and more safe in terms of political economic development issues? And as an effect of that, you have had then, as Dan also mentioned, the establishment of several new parties, political parties in Tigray, whereas 3 of them is more ethno-nationalist oriented. driving a lot of this discourse. And together with the new younger generations of Tigrayan intellectuals, both at home and in diaspora, are also very much contributing to what has been termed the Tigray de facto statehood process. A process to prepare for and protect actual de facto statehood in Tigray. And I have done research over the last couple of years on this process and just wrote an extensive report earlier this year where that was outlined, and which have apparently a rather broad-based support of a much stronger degree of political autonomy and an actual de facto state capacity in Tigray, but still within the framework of a federal Ethiopia. The main political parties and the main kind of opinion leaders in Tigray are advocating that process. You have only one party, Tigray Independence Party, who has already kind of given up Ethiopia and openly advocates for succession and an independent Tigray. The rest is not there yet. But you see, this is a moving target. And that's where you see the discourse are changing week by week among the broad sentiments of the people, but also among the political actors. And you also see how TPLF is pushed more and more over to a much more ethno-nationalist position than they have ever had before. Viewing the latest expressions both by Debretsion but also Getachew Reda and so on, where they just some few months back would certainly seriously downplay or outright reject any process leading towards a succession of Tigray. Today, they don't do that. They don't advocate it openly, but they hold it open now as a possibility, considering what is happening with the rest of Ethiopia. In this process over the last few years then, it has been a reorientation away from Ethiopia, away from an Ethiopian all-embracing identity, you can say, or belongingness, to something else. And that's where Eritrea obviously comes in, Eritrean people comes in much more directly. And this builds on, of course, as you all know, the historical and cultural long-term intimacy between Tigray and Eritrean highlands at least, but also other parts of Eritrea. And the fact that over the last 20 years, you have had several hundred thousands, I think nobody knows the exact number, and not even Dan, I think, have the cumulated number of Eritreans coming into Tigray, either transiting or settling. But we are talking about maybe 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 at least. And that has, again, reconnected the people-to-people relationships between these two groups divided by the border. At least as seen from the Tigrayan side, because they are the receiving population and the receiving territory of Eritreans. But also the 3 months of opening of the border, you saw a lot of Tigrayans enter into Tigray, a lot of Tigrayans enter into Eritrea, visiting family, visiting friends, visiting Asmara, visiting Massawa, and certainly expressed the feeling of not only cultural connection, but also a feeling of common belongingness, so to say, and wanting that to continue. And here you have now both individuals but also organizations saying that what Tigray needs to do is, of course, rethink and reconceptualize. As we rethink and reconceptualize our relationship to West Ethiopia, we need to rethink and reconceptualize our future relationship to Eritrea. And I'm not then talking about people to people, but I'm talking about political entities. How should Tigray as a political entity relate to Eritrea? What kind of possibly new configuration can we foresee in the near future? and what kind of model should that be? A confederal model, a federal model, or a unitary model for that matter. But you have a clear articulation of an interest that a possible independent Tigray should not stand alone. It has then to stand together with Eritrea within a certain political framework. And that political framework is not yet defined. But that, of course, since that is such a lively discourse and the issues happening and the processes in Ethiopia is unraveling as we speak, so to say, I think that's become much more a pressing need on Tigrayan political actors to go further, to really strategize on how to go about to implement such a process, so to say, where you have a political realignment between the Eritrean, not only the Eritrean people, but between the Eritrean state somehow and the Tigray de facto state. So that's I'm going to end there, and that's the because it is such in the making. So I will not conclude or predict any outcome of this. Of course, it can be reversed, it can be skewed, it can be stopped by events happening in Ethiopia, and there are several triggering factors in the near future which might turn this around, so to say. What's happening in Oromia today, and with a possible remobilization of a Ero protest movement, but certainly the main triggering factor in the near future is the Tigray regional election and how the federal government will relate to that. Thank you. I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Kjetil, both for clarity and for being on time and for reminding people quite how fluid the situation is in Tigray. Now, as I said earlier on, Kjetil may get cut off at 4 o'clock by his regional electricity company.
Or even before. So.
Even before, okay. So what I suggest is, because our next session is questions, observations and answers, and I have a couple of people lined up already, but before I go to them, could I call on anybody who wants to specifically ask Kjetil about what he's just been talking about to raise their hand, please?
Yeah.
It may be that Paulos. So I have Fesahai wanting to ask a question. Over to you.
I'm also here.
Yeah,
okay,
well,
so
if you click on the participants, in the right-hand side, you will see you can raise your hand. At the moment, we have the first person is Fesahai Waldesus, and then Gabre, and then
Paulos.
Yes.
I'm also
right,
here.
Guy I've got as well. Okay, so
okay.
Fesahai can talk. I'm going to time everyone. I want everyone to be as quickly as short as possible, and certainly at 3 minutes I'll cut people off.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the excellent talks, Dan and Kjetil. Really appreciate it. I just want to ask Kjetil, because I want him to see the Eritrean version of what the Tigray prospect you are talking. Me coming from Karen, it irritates me. Okay, and it is something I will never dream to happen in Eritrea. We will start again the armed struggle to get rid of the Tigray part from Eritrea. So I don't know, I know the Agazian is coming, the TPLF, it is cornered its side, so it has to think. Because when we think of foreign policy, we are forgetting the Eritrea has got two parts, has got the Sudan neighborhood, the three part actually, the Sudan neighborhood, the Tigray neighborhood, and then the Red Sea at all. So why should we get involved in Tigray's mess. I just want to know. I know Isaias took us through that path. Okay, we have paid price for Badme as Eritreans during armed struggle, not now. During armed struggle, we paid price. Okay, alliance with Tigray is not an Eritrean issue.
Okay.
It is of those who are not Eritreans. Okay, so I just want you to elaborate on that. Yes, Isaias and his likes would like that. How about the Eritreans, the real Eritreans who fought for independence of Eritrea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for Sahai. Shetel, do you want to reply to that now?
Okay, I can be very quick. And of course, as you understood, I only saw it from the perspective of Tigray because that was my assignment. That's, of course, not to the belittlement of the Eritrean interest here, not at all. So I hope you understand that. And I think, you raised some very fair questions, Fesai. What is the interest of Eritrea in such a possible reconfigured political alignment? That's obviously a question the Eritrean people need to answer. You don't have any agency today in defining the state and the state's interest. Hopefully you will have an agency in the near future to participate in that and to influence that. I think, viewing it purely pragmatically, analytically from the outside, I certainly see a lot of interest that Eritrea should be linked to Tigray and Ethiopia in many ways, economically, development-wise, socially, culturally, and so on and so forth. No doubt about that. But the political...
Paulus,
can you
mute yourself,
hear me?
Paulus.
Shetel, I can hear you fine.
Who is talking about not hearing? Okay, so it's not concerning me. I think you. I'm just want to end with that. I think you raised a fair point. It's certainly something which will influence the process going forward. Obviously, that this cannot be a top-down decision. Hopefully, yeah. Although on the Agassian movement, that was rather more prominent a year or two back in Tigray. Now it is very much marginalized discourse, mainly because also the most propagandists of the Agassian movement are now leaders of Tigray Independence Party and kind of have a much more a different kind of ideological basis for the discourse than Agassian movement. In Tigray. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Shetel. I've got Gabriel next, and then Martin, and then Guy.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very
yes. Clear. Very good. I would like to thank the presenters, Dan Connell and Shetel. Dan Connell, this is the background.
It's Rama. It's Rama.
You are there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Visiting that area, and I know physically the place, so that's why I have it. Okay. My question is to Shetel, and it is related to what has been said. This international relations and foreign relations, and it cannot be done. It cannot be designed through emotions. Eritrea as a nation state its foreign relations should be based on its national interest. So that means we have to define our national interest. And now we cannot just take Eritrea from where it is, just we have our neighbors, and the history of that place also plays a role. And this long history, complicated relationships, and as you know, the Horn of Africa has never been stable for an extended period of time. So any foreign relation designed to serve Eritrea should be based on that fact. We cannot just ignore. We cannot just ignore what is happening in Ethiopia and our in the Sudan and the others as well. So how can we, based on this is objective analysis, how can we use what is going on in Ethiopia to serve the national interest of Eritrea, particularly people in the opposition, because we know that ISAS is not serving the national interest of Eritrea, is trying to sell Eritrea out. We know that, but the people on the opposition, how can we make use of this, what is going on in Ethiopia to serve the national interest of Eritrea?
Okay.
And I do understand that, well, of course, that history tells that you have this dichotomy as far as the Tigrayans are concerned. So can we work with them? That's what I'm looking at. So would you like to comment on that? Thank you very much.
Okay, Shetel, do you want to come back on that before we take another one?
Okay, very quickly again. And Gebre, of course, I agree with what you say. It's up to the Eritrean people and government to design their international relations and interests. Today, the people are not on board, and I think the government is not the government. So in the future, that has to be like that. I think, considering the current, and I 100% agree with you, the Horn of Africa is one of the most conflict-prone areas in the world. And sadly, in my interpretation of events, it will continue to be so for a considerable amount of time ahead of us. It will not stabilize. It will probably deteriorate even further. And in that context, I would be hesitant to advise or recommend Eritreans of any kind to get too deeply involved in Ethiopian affairs, because it might backfire severely on the Eritrean interests and Eritrean people. You see already today there are lots of rumors circulating in Ethiopia on Eritrean renewed activity in lieu of the peace process, or in the shadow of the peace process. This activity is probably endangering a more long-term friendly relationship between Eritrean and Ethiopian people. And that is something to be worried about and to be careful about. So as I advise most internationals, or all internationals, stay away from the fry. It's up to the people themselves to try to sort it out. And whatever advice or whatever interest we can project into that will not solve anything. It will rather tilt the balance or exaggerate conflict dynamics in Ethiopia.
Okay, thanks, Shetel. I have Martin next. Martin, have you a question for Shetel?
It's either for Shetel or for Dan, and apologies that I came late and I don't know whether Dan dealt with this. If he did, then please just stop me, and I'm perfectly happy to pick it up later. The question I wanted to really ask was, and it wasn't really raised yesterday when we dealt with the economy, and I think it's a huge gap, and that is the problem of the Bir Nakfa and the relations across the border, and which was so destructive and was, I mean, this is something you've written about, David, about it, and such a possible spark for the conflict. While everybody talks about, Budmate, they don't really talk about the economic problems. And I just wonder how any of the three of you feel that this could be dealt with in a way that looks forward rather than backwards.
Okay, Shetel, do you want to deal with that? I know you had insights into what happened immediately after the borders were opened.
Yes, it's one very interesting fluctuation of the exchange rate between the Bir and the Nakfa. At start, where the Bir so much stronger, and then it equaled out on parity, and then suddenly the Nakfa was considerably stronger than the Bir in an artificial strength because the lack of physical currency as such when the Ethiopian traders, Tigrayan traders wanted to get involved in the Eritrean economy. But going forward, yes, certainly I 100% agree with you, Martin, that these things has to be settled. And we know there is, 3 key agreements, 3 key bilateral agreement has been drafted. The cross-border trade, macroeconomic relationship, and the port agreement, where with the macroeconomic...
What was the last one?
The bilateral trade and the cross-border trade agreements have been drafted and are ready. From Ethiopia, they want to sign it several months ago, last year, but Isaias is holding back on that. And that is regulating trade relationship and currency relationship to a certain degree. Of course, these are not made public. We hear rumors about how the framework is organized, and we hear certainly it has been articulated an interest from Eritrea that the currency should be on parity again, but Ethiopia is holding back on that. The main concern today, as we saw pre-1998, is exactly the informality of the discussions of such issues and the lack of transparency of discussions on these issues and the lack of institutionalization of it might again collapse whatever is the peace process is today.
Okay, thank you very much, Shetlin. Just for those of you that weren't in yesterday's session, there was some discussion of the Nakfa, not so much in relation to cross-border ties with Tigray, but more broadly in terms of remittance flows post any change. So I have Gaim and then Sarah. So Gaim, over to you.
Hey, David.
Dan, what's up?
I'm sorry, Dan. Sorry. Well, a little aside here. When I was at the border a year and a half ago, the Nakfa was being traded right there by money changers at the border. And I asked to see it. And one of the things that I noticed was that in the handful of bills, many of them were the old bills that were being folded into the exchanges because they looked the same except for the date on them. But
okay. Yeah.
Leave that one aside.
Yeah, let's leave that to one side. There are technical aspects of this. Gaim, very quickly, from you.
Sorry.
Gaim, you need to unmute.
Thank you for the excellent presentations. I just would like to underscore what Fisahe said on the future union of Eritrea and Tigray. Theoretically, there is nothing wrong. The more people are united, the stronger they are. But when we speak about Eritrea, we only speak about the Eritrean highlands. But in reality, the level of animosity, ironically, is much stronger between the Eritrean highlands and the Tigrayans. The Tigrayans have a positive attitude towards Eritreans, at least those who are politically active. Beginning from Adula, the crimes Adula committed against the Atamarem, the Kunama, the Nara, and the level of inhumane treatment Eritreans received in the Badime area prior to the border war, when the Tigrayan regional government was unilaterally redrawing the borders. I have relatives. I happen to be from an area where my relatives, my uncles, have migrated to the Shilalo area. And sometimes they cross into Western Tigray. And the way they were treated during and before the border war, if you talk to those people and they heard you talking about bringing these two people together, in the long term maybe, but there is a high level of animosity. So this intimacy people talk about between the Highland Eritreans and the Tigrayans, it's a myth. I'm just reading 2 books written by prominent Tigrayans, Gobro Asrat's book in Amharic and the Aragawi Berhes thesis. I mean, the level of animosity they express for the Eritreans. What hope is there for these people to be united with Eritreans? And the EPLF's view of the TPLF is equally hostile. So I think maybe in the future, far beyond the present generation, I don't know. I don't think there is animosity between the Tigrayans as people and the Eritreans as people, but the experiences the Eritreans have, even during the 30 Years' War. I happened to be in Asmara in the mid-70s. And the people who were really treating Eritreans as if they were not human beings, being used as agents by the Ethiopian army, were Tigrayans who spoke the same language, who lived in the same neighborhood with the Eritreans. And the level of animosity there is between those peoples is deep-rooted.
That was my 3-minute noise.
Okay, I will stop here.
Okay. Okay, Gaim. It's good that Gaim was the first to overrun the 3 minutes because we know each other fairly well.
David.
Yes, who's asking?
It's Paulos. There are people asking questions on the chat.
Yes.
There's a Hiyab Johannes is asking,
yes.
What does it mean by tweaking the border agreement? That is question for Dan Connell, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I saw that. In fact, I was just going to say, what I suggest is we take Sarah's question next. So okay. Sarah, if you want to ask your question, and then effectively I saw Hiyab's question for Dan. What does it mean to tweak the border agreement? So we'll take that after that. And just to flag to people, you can type in questions and either Paulos or I will see those. Sarah, over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for the insightful presentation. My question is both kind of suggestion and a question, because as Gaim said, there has been quite a lot of animosity between the people Shetil was referring to having same culture or similar culture or similar background. That is the Highlanders in Eritrea and the Tigrayans. However, with all the blood spilled and with all the animosity created and with all the hate drum beaten by both governments or people in power, don't you think that it is, if those people who beat the drum of hate and kind of exasperated all the hate and the grudge that was between these two people during the dark time, had these two people beaten the drum of love and forgiveness, do you think we would be here? Because I am feeling that whenever the leaders beat the drum of peace, people think of peace. And whenever they want war, people are going to war. So don't you think that it is the kind and the type of governments that is actually playing the major role in creating these very, very dangerous situations in the country, in the area, in the region itself? So, and also, why wouldn't the West intervene so that this kind of animosity, this kind of threat, this kind of like explosive situation that we have between these two countries won't spill over to other countries in the region as well? Thank you. That's all I want to ask.
Sarah, thank you very much. It seems to me that we have now lost Shetil. So Dan, do you want to answer that question, and then Hiab's question as well. What do you mean by tweaking the border agreement?
Yeah. Well, I have 3 points I want to address. Just as a quick thing, the background, recognize that, anybody? That's Badme in 1987.
Whoa.
Actually, 1985, I'm sorry, 1985. When I was there with the EPLF. Gebre made the point you cannot ignore Ethiopia and other neighboring states. And I think that is where I come out on this as well, between perhaps that and Shettle's notion. It's way too early to be talking about political relationships between states. I think any of the states involved at this point. The immediate problem is the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which has only been partially solved. There's an agreement between Abiy and Isaias, but not between all of Ethiopia and all of Eritrea. As long as there is still hostility between Eritrea and Tigray, and I think the source of that is largely inside Asmara, the situation will not change within Eritrea, because that's what Isaias uses to keep everybody under the repressive regime that he's running right now. And he will continue to attempt to destabilize Ethiopia to create an advantage for himself within an unstable Ethiopia, none of which is in Eritrea's interest. So you may not want to get involved, but you are affected by this, and the involvement could be what is aimed at Asmara to try to end this unnecessary continuing hostility. The TPLF has all kinds of things to answer for, but it has indicated clearly an interest in peace. I don't think that they would hold back on the border if there were an agreement to end hostilities and create a sustainable peace with Asmara, and if Debretsion and Isaias were in talks to that effect. I think they're not going to pull out or allow the federal troops to pull out of the areas they're in until that happens, because they are in a squeeze between the Amhara, Abiy, and Asmara at the same time. The last thing, just one last thing here. The open borders, there are not going to be any open borders between two states with differing systems inside. That was what we saw the first time around. If you have a closed economy on one side and an open economy, a relatively open on the other, you can't really afford to open it up. So Isaias is still in a position where he has to maintain a level of conflict and postpone normalization.
Okay, Dan, thanks. Dan, could you just briefly address
tweaking the border? Sorry, yeah. I forgot. Tweaking the border. The issue that has been most divisive on the Tigrayan side, at least, has been the Arab one, because about 20% of the Arab territory goes to Eritrea under the boundary agreement. They have long had the position that they want to create swaps between Eritrean villages south of Sorona with people who identify as Eritreans who are given to Ethiopia. But if that doesn't happen, it may not, because Isaias may never agree to anything that smacks of compromise. Then there has to be resettlement options for the people who live in areas that go to one side or the other and are not feeling comfortable and secure living under the opposite government. That's all. So tweaking is a matter that I think paragraph 16 of the the Boundary Commission decision, it's the one right after final and binding the border. Paragraph 16 deals with affected peoples. There is room for that kind of agreement, but only if both sides completely agree. And if they don't, you go to the border that's in that agreement. And I think that there would not be a problem, as I said, with Tigray, the state, or TPLF, the movement, pulling out from areas that it now occupies, or that the federal troops occupy, if there were peace. So I think peace, a sustainable peace remains the obstacle here. And I think, as I said, the source of that difficulty is largely in Asmara.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I've got Araya Dabasai next, and Dan, if you look, there's actually a written question from Tesfa Alam, which you could have a look at in the chat and consider that.
Okay.
Araya, over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, both speakers. Really, it was very insightful talk. The point I want to really address very quickly is, much as I understand the bitterness that was expressed by both Dr. Mabratu and also Professor Gaim, I suggest that we do not dwell on the past. I think it will be to our best interest to focus in the future. Much as we have to make a distinction now. The former Syrian leaders as opposed to the current ones. The Gobru Asrats and others, I think they are discredited, but there are other new leaders who have a different view for their best interest. It is to their interest to establish better relationship with Eritrea now. I mean, after the removal of this regime, and therefore, instead of us dwelling on the past, I think we need to cultivate a good relationship, because if we have to have any access to Eritrea, I think it will be through Tigray, of course, through Sudan. But I don't think we should spend too much of our time thinking or looking back on and being bitter about the past history. I think we need to, it is to our best interest to be future-oriented. That's really a matter of comment rather than a question. Thank you, David.
Okay, Araya, many thanks. I do have a queue waiting. It's Suleiman next. So Suleiman, could you ask your question? And then after that, I actually want to call on Musi Ephraim to talk. So firstly, Suleiman with a brief question.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Dan. And I know Shetel is gone, but I would like to thank him as well, both of you, for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I wrote down my question because I thought I was not seeing. But here is my question. I want to take you back, Dan, to the incident that was triggered by to the situation that was triggered by the assassination of the young Oromo artist on Monday in Addis. When I was listening yesterday to what both the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the head of the regional state said following the incident, of course, none of them explicitly named the TPLF, but it was pretty clear that they accused the TPLF and some of the Oromo nationalists that are opposed to the government, as well as a foreign force. Probably they meant Egypt, although they have not named any one of them. So my question here is, how do you think, I mean, if you could reflect on that, this implicit accusation towards the EPLF would impact on the already complicated relationship between the Prosperity Party, which is heading the federal government, and the TPLF-led Tigray? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suleiman. Dan, do you want to reply to that or not really?
Sure.
I mean, it's quite an open thing.
Yeah, no, I see the question that's been asked, Suleiman, on the chat room too. I don't know where this is going to go, and I think we need to be careful of jumping onto this. But I also read in Amhara media today the accusations directed at TPLF. If they did, it's big problems for TPLF and for Tigray in general, and for Ethiopia as a whole, not just between Abiy, but also the Oromo people. So this would be a disastrous situation, if so. It also is unclear to me that that's what happened. It just seems like such an idiotic thing to have done that I cannot imagine it, but I could be wrong. So I want to wait and see. It's a very dangerous situation. The more likely scenario is the other one that you mentioned, then that's floating around in the media, and that's that Egypt might have had something to do with it. The accusations are that this was Oromos who did it. They were mercenaries for somebody else, whatever that means. I would say wait and see. It's a very dangerous and very fluid situation.
You want to answer that question, Dan, that was written from
Tesfa Alam? Yes. Tesfa Alam asked a question about the political détente was conditioned between Eritrea and Ethiopia was conditioned by Isaias on squeezing TPLF. Can I elaborate further? I was told by people that had a connection to Abiy's office when I was in Addis in February, that was what Isaias had said to Abiy: stop the flow of refugees. The consequence of that is twofold. One is that it's an attempt to stem the flow out of people that Eritrea can't afford to lose. So there's that interest. The other is that it has the effect of creating a social crisis in Tigray because of all these people who then come in that the Tigray state is responsible for. I'm not sure that that was a specific goal of the Eritrean or of Isaias's push, but he is pushing on Abiy to make it tougher for TPLF before he wants to open up the border. And my understanding was that the concession that Abiy was looking for was the opening of the road to Assab for trade that would not really impact the rest of Eritrea, but would benefit both states.
Okay, Dan, thanks. Thank you very much. So just a quick kind of rain check just to clarify for people. So we're now at 4:20. Sheto has left. I've got some people with their hands up. Just to note to everyone, if you click on the chat button, which is on the bar, if you move your cursor at the bottom, you can contribute to the group chat. You'll see that several people have started to interact on that as well. I guess we probably won't be able to take all the issues that are in the chat, but they will remain there as a record. However, I did say that we just move away from the questions to take Musi Ephraim, who I know is in the room somewhere. Musi, would you like to take the floor for a few minutes?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, just a reflection. I mean, beside taking into account the internal political disputes in Ethiopia or the ethnical conflicts between different political groups, and the same thing that the unconstitutional government of Eritrea, we should even try to understand the entire region. I mean, you have to look on the overcrowdedness of the importance of the Horn of Africa, such as the United Arab Emirates' role in both Somaliland and Puntland, even Eritrea since 2015, and the Saudis' role in Djibouti, Turkey's role, the same thing in Mogadishu, because there is a battle about the political and economic dominance in that region, which is part of the process between Asmara and Eritrea. In that case, we will get a broader picture. That was the only reflection I had so far.
Okay, thank you, Musi. In fact, you know, we will come to that in the second section after Martin's paper.
David.
Yes.
David, the people who already asked questions, they need to put their hands down. And then we got Nazi Emane also. You've been waiting for a long time.
Yeah, okay, so if you have asked your question, you need to click on the hand button and your hand will disappear. I think we've got Mohammed here next. Mohammed, do you want to ask a question? Is Mohammed there?
Yes. Actually, I want to make a remark. I usually am from the western part of Eritrea, and I usually get irritated by searchers when they talk about the Eritrea-Ethiopia relations. They just talk about the Tigrinya in Eritrea and the Tigrinya in Ethiopia, as if there are no other people in other parts of Eritrea who have links to other countries. And as a non-Tigrinya speaker, I would like to see that there is peace between the Tigrinya speakers in Tigray and in Eritrea, and they are friendly, because that is in the interest, in our national interest. But I would like to bring the issue of, also many times before, I mean, articles written, when people refer to the armed struggle, it's just the EPLF. They never mention the ELF. So I think people have to be really holistic in their approach. And my point is about Sudan. What is going on in Sudan now? Because it affects also the western part of Eritrea, and it affects Eritrea as well. The Eritrean regime always sees its borders as a security borders, security threat. So in one way or another, for example, the regime is trying to flare up ethnic tensions in Sudan. I've been following, and there is the sharing power agreement between the military and the Forces for Freedom and Change. And the Eritrean regime has been always in support of the military. ISIS has been there for a number of times. So I would like also to touch on that. And now we have this Jared Dam problem, where Sudan is now siding with Egypt instead of... So where does this Sudan factor play into all this? Eritrea, Tigray, Ethiopia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohammed. And I think it's useful to be reminded, just as Shetul was talking, that the situation in Tigray is so fluid and therefore is very uncertain in terms of future relations with Eritrea. It's very much the case in Sudan, as Mohammed has said as well. So I have Yebio next on the list, people with their hands having raised through Moodle. So Yebio, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just have some remarks here. I just don't want to go in detail what Gabriel articulated, followed by Raya and Sarah regarding the Tigray-Eritrean relationship, or actually between Eritrea and Ethiopian relationship. You know, we have to go beyond that. You know, so I don't want to go over those things again. But what the remark made by my brother Gaim regarding Alula, for instance, Abdullah did plunder, of course, in the Western Highlands. So did in the same happened in the Eritrean plateau also. That's not something that I should remember, which Araya said we should not even talk about that. We look at it as historical and let's pass it, you know. The other thing is, during the armed struggle, the Tigrays were, you know, counter-revolutionaries. In a sense, they were fighting against the struggle, but so were Eritreans, you know. So this is has nothing to do because they have this Eritrean blood, actually Tigray blood. Actually, it's we have people from Tigray. I mean, born in Eritrea, perhaps some of them second generation, but who heroically fought and achieved Eritrean independence. Therefore, we cannot really generally talk about this thing. The other thing is, why are we assuming that the Tigray wants us? Why, or Ethiopia wants Eritrea? No, this is something we Eritreans always think in terms of we are superior than the others. Therefore, hey, they want us perhaps for the ports. I would give them for the port. Actually, I would lobby for it. Even if Tigray is independent, I will lobby for them to use Massawa and Assab, stays with Ethiopia. So this is, we should not dwell on that. The other thing is, I'm telling now to the foreigners we have here, every Eritrean must have a Tigrayan blood. There must have been, I mean, it's not by accident that we find Isaias Afwerki on the throne in Eritrea, or his minions, which most of them are from, have some Tigray blood. It shows you that there has always been crossbreeding. I may talk of the lowland also. The lowlanders, they're not totally, they weren't against Alula as such. At one time, you have 2,000 Beni Amr army siding with Alula, fighting against the at Kufti, for instance, at Kufi. So we must not dwell on these past things, but actually see on our positive. Otherwise, we would be the victims, like we have been victims starting from the late 18th century.
Yeah, that was my 3-minute noise.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm done. I made my point.
Okay. Thank you, Yabio. I've got, I know Teami has got his hand up physically rather than via Zoom. So Teami, let's go to you, and then Abdul Qadir, and then I suggest we take a break. So Teami.